Yesterday, Sayadaw explained on gross form of Paṇḍitā and gross form of Apamāda. So the gross form of Paṇḍitā means committing 3 kinds of bodily misconduct and 4 kinds of verbal misconduct. So if one cannot control oneself so that one will not be committing these 7 kinds of misconduct, 3 in the bodily misconduct, 4 of the verbal misconduct. So if one cannot refrain from these misconduct, then one will be committing, transgressing these misconduct, and one will be morally degraded. And not only he/she will be morally degraded, but other people will also get hurt. And the person who commits these transgressions, the person who commits these misconduct by body and speech, he/she does not have any patience, forgiveness, or sacrifice when dealing with others. He/she does not have compassion towards others. And because the person does not know that these misconduct are things that are frightening and disgusting, not knowing, these persons, they transgress or they commit these misconduct by lack of moral shame and moral fear. So committing these transgressions, committing these misconduct, one is said to be having Paṇḍitā. One is said to be having negligence, failure, heedlessness, forgetfulness. So in this way, one does not have any control, failing to refrain from these misconduct. So he/she is also failing one's responsibility or duty as a human being. So there is a definite law that if one commits 3 kinds of misconduct, if one lets his or her mind go freely on the misconduct, and if he/she commits these transgression, misconduct, and violence, then there is Paṇḍitā arising in himself or herself. So this is a definite law. And also, there is another law which is just the opposite. If one does not let his or her mind go freely on these 3 kinds of misconduct, then there will be Apamāda. But if one does not have any control with mindfulness, one will be committing these misconduct. And if one repeatedly lets the mind go free on these misconduct, there will be more of transgression. So he/she is letting the mind go free repeatedly on these misconduct, not caring what will happen, but will repeatedly free his or her mind in these misconduct. So that will lead to more transgression. So in order not to happen like that, one needs to have vigilance, one needs to have mindfulness, and one should have the courage in order to refrain from these misconduct. So if one can have control on oneself to refrain from these misconduct from the very beginning, then she will find it easier to control the mind again and again, not to let the mind in doing these misconduct. So, if one understands that committing these misconduct are shameful and frightening, having this moral shame and moral fear, she will refrain from these misconduct and will not let his mind or her mind go freely on the misconduct. And having compassion, having consideration and compassion towards others, knowing that if I do not want to be hurt by others' misconduct, others will be the same. Others will not want others do not want to be hurt also. So having compassion and consideration towards others, one will have control over himself, herself. So having control of himself, herself, not letting his or her mind go freely on these misconduct, with compassion, consideration, moral shame and moral fear, it is said to be Anapana. So this is another definite law. So these definite laws are actually taught by the Buddha. So these niyama or definite law, fixed law, were taught by the Buddha in Abhidhamma discourses called Vipanga, one of the kind of Abhidhamma. So yesterday, Saraji explained on these Paṇḍitā and Anapana from both theoretical and practical aspects. And today, Saraji will go on to explain how to overcome the mental misconduct. So, in order to refrain from bodily and verbal misconduct, one should know that these misconduct are improper. One should have moral shame, moral fear, and compassion towards others. So having moral shame, moral fear, and compassion, one should refrain from these misconduct. One should avoid them, such that I will not do the bodily misconduct. I will not talk verbal misconduct. So, by refraining so as not to commit bodily misconduct and verbal misconduct, these misconducts are refrained. So, one should refrain from these misconduct so that one will not be hurting others. So one should avoid, one should stay away from these misconduct by body and speech so as not to hurt others. And the other day, Saraji explained that there are frightening diseases in the world. And in the past, in the olden days, there were frightening diseases such as plague or smallpox. So Saraji compared these misconduct with these frightening diseases. And nowadays, the frightening illness such as AIDS, the AIDS has been affecting the people in the world, and people are afflicted with these AIDS and they are suffering. So in the present time, people are afflicted with these kind of diseases, and in the future as well, there will be also frightening diseases. So most of the people are afraid of these frightening diseases. So being afraid of these diseases alone is not beneficial. It is not beneficial just to be afraid of the diseases. So the medical professors, in order to ease the fear of the people, they are finding ways in order to avoid these diseases. So they are inventing methods how to avoid these diseases. Having faith and confidence on having faith and confidence on these medical professors and following their guidance of these medical professors, people are able to avoid these diseases. In order to avoid these diseases, one should stay away from the place where the disease is taking place. So if one goes or travels to the place where people are afflicted with these diseases, then one will catch the disease. So in order to avoid the kind of disease, one should also avoid oneself from going to these places. And the other kind of diseases that are not so frightening, one should cure these diseases. So when the disease takes place, one should take necessary measures right away in order to cure and suppress the disease, so that the disease will become weaker and weaker, and finally it will be uprooted and eradicated. So just as one needs to uproot and eradicate the illness or disease in the body, in the same way, one needs to try very hard, one needs to diligently work so as to overcome the mental disease. So physical disease is not as frightening as mental disease, because physical diseases, one can face physical diseases only at times only, but mental diseases can arise all the time. So one should understand that one should avoid, prevent, cure, suppress, uproot and eradicate the mental diseases. So if a kind of work is very important, then one should not be slow to work. And it is very important also that one should not be slow. One should work very fast in the most effective way and to a very complete level. So if that work is important, the person himself, herself, and the family will need to work very hard. So one needs to plan. One needs to plan if it is very important. One needs to plan. It is something that one must do. So in the same way, just as people are careful in avoiding or preventing the physical illness, in the same way, one should understand that it is very important to avoid, refrain, prevent, cure, suppress, uproot, and eradicate the mental disease. So it is also very important to cure this mental disease. One should not be slow. One should be very fast, and one should work very effectively, completely, so as to avoid, prevent, cure, suppress, uproot, and eradicate the mental disease. So in order to have good habit by body and speech, it is said, avitekamo sila. So by refraining misconduct, one will have good behavior by body and speech. And it is called Cetana Sila if one has this volition to refrain from this misconduct, then it will become Cetana Sila. And it will be easy to refrain from these misconduct. One will have to practice the habit of refraining from these misconduct by body and speech. But in order to refrain from mental misconduct, the wrong belief, the mental misconduct, such as wanting to take other people's belongings by force, wanting others to be killed or destroyed, and having wrong view that there is nothing after death. So these mental misconduct should be, it is not enough just to be refraining or avoiding these mental misconduct. So just by having the volition to avoid from these misconduct is not enough. So just like the diseases, one needs to prevent before the disease arises, and if the disease takes place, then one should cure it right away. So in the same way, in order to stay away from these mental misconduct, one should know the correct method how to prevent and how to cure these mental misconduct. So Satipatthana meditation is the way to prevent and cure the mental misconduct. And Sayadaw will explain how these mental misconduct are originated. So these mental misconduct are originated in the sensual objects that most of the people like. So most of the people who are in this sensual realm, they are forgetting because they are having the pleasure in the sense objects. That's why it is said that Panchasuva Kamagunesu Citasa Vasako Vasakanupadana. It means that the people are letting their mind go freely on the 5 kinds of sensual objects without having any control of their mind. And if the mind is left uncontrolled on these sense objects, they do not control in time, but they just let the mind go freely on these sense objects repeatedly. So this is called Paṇḍitā. So it means that failure to refrain oneself so as to be in moderate, one is failing, and it is called Paṇḍitā. So when we say sense object, 5 kinds of sense objects, in Pali it is called Kama Guna. Kama means things that are desirable. So desirable objects are called Kama. And these sensual objects catch or make bondage to the person who is interested, so that the person will not be freed. So it means that these sense objects are catching or bonding or making bondage, captivating the person who is liking or who is very interested in these objects. And usually men and women, they are desiring each other among themselves. So what the men desire most of all, and mostly what the men desire is in the women. And what the women desire, the things that the women desire, are mostly in men. And also, not only that there will be desirable objects among the opposite sex, but also people desire objects of the same sex also. So these sensual objects are made up of 5 kinds. These are the sight, the sound, smell, taste, and touch. So these 5 consist of these 5 sensual objects. So among the 5, taste or flavor is one of them. So the kind of taste or flavor that the other person cooks or prepares is also a desirable object, a desirable sensual object. And also the kind of feeling or sensation one can get by making use of clothes or bedding is also sensual object. So in order to get these 5 kinds of sensual objects, things such as money, gold, jewelry, property, home, or vehicle, they are also included in sensual objects. So if one is thinking about these sensual objects, if one is letting one's mind go freely on these sensual objects, and if one is having attachment, craving on these sensual objects, it is also called Paṇḍitā. So, to say the definite law, the niyama, it means that if the person is letting his or her mind go freely on these desirable objects, these 5 kinds of sensual objects, and if one is attached and craving on these objects, desirable objects and sensual objects, it is called Paṇḍitā. He, she is said to be having failure, negligence, heedlessness. So, if one lets one mind go free, then the sight, sound, smell, taste or touch of the opposite sex will become desiring, and these 5 sense objects will make bondage or captivate the person who is interested in these sensual objects. So these 5 kinds of sensual objects are most effective in bonding, captivating the person who is interested in them, so that he, she cannot be freed. So in order to stay away from this sense, in order to overcome this attachment, one cannot just abstain from them, but one should be mindful. So whatever object that arises, one should be mindful, so one should have protection with mindfulness. And also this Indriya Samvara, restraint of the faculty with mindfulness, is needed. So especially during the practicing of the meditation, it is very important to practice Indriya Samvara, restraint of the senses. During a Buddha's time, a king approached a young monk and asked question, Venerable, you are very young, so how can you overcome the sensual desire? How do you control yourself to overcome the craving or sensual desire? So the young monk replied that when the monk came across people of opposite sex, the monk regards them as mother or auntie, aunt or sister. So by regarding them as one's own mother, aunt or sister, then no more of these sensual desire. But the king was not satisfied with this answer, because the king said, even though one regards the person of opposite sex as family or relative, but then again the mind can go freely. So the young monk gave another answer. The monk said that he looked at the person of opposite sex, dissecting or looking at her bit by bit, hair one bit, the head hair one bit, and the body hair, and nails and toenails, teeth and skin. So taking a look at her bit by bit. So if one takes a look at her as a whole, then one will think of him or her, one will think of her as desirable, pleasant and beautiful. So that's why he looked at her bit by bit, so that this beautiful one will not see beauty in her. So, but the king was still not satisfied with this answer, because the king said, even though one is reflecting the foulness or loathsomeness, but at times the mind will still take it as beautiful. So the king was not satisfied with this answer also. And the third answer that the young monk gave was on Indriya Samvara, restraint of the senses. So even though he sees, he pretends not to see. He restrains his eye, he restrains his ear, and so on. Having mindfulness and having restraint of the eye, ear, and so on, the monk will not have any sensual desire. So when hearing this answer, the king was satisfied, and the king agreed to this answer because it was his personal experience. So what was the king's experience was that when the king was going to the princesses, if the king did not have control of his mind, the king was just like a bull who is without a tying rope. But if the king went to the queens and princesses with restraint on his senses, then he was much relieved of the sensual desire. So the king accepted, the king was satisfied with the third answer, the answer to the question on Indriya Samvara Sila, the restraint of the senses. So Sayadaw said also would like the yogis to practice Indriya Samvara, restraint of the senses. So if the yogi is being mindful on whatever object that arises, then the yogi will be free from the bondage of the sensual objects. And when the yogi practices diligently, practices mindfulness diligently, she will be free from the bondage of sensual objects. And also, she will be free from bondage of the defilement, and the yogi will gain happiness. So when Sayadaw said yogis should practice Indriya Samvara, restraint of the senses, it means that yogi should note continuously with sustained mindfulness whatever object that arises, such as rising and falling of the abdomen. So the yogi should be noting every arising object continuously with sustained mindfulness. So the characteristic of sati is apilapana lekhana. Sati has the nature or characteristic of not wobbling, not in the surface or superficial, but not floating, but it will sink, the sati will sink into the object. So just as if you throw stone into the water, the stone will sink into the water. So in the same way, mindfulness should be sinking into the object. So it is the characteristic of mindfulness. So yogis should note in such a way so that mindfulness will not be floating or wobbling, but it will sink into the object. Only then the characteristic of sati, mindfulness, will be obvious. And the function of sati is asamosa rasa. It means that mindfulness has the function of not losing sight of the object. So when an object arises, mindfulness should be there right away. And when another object arises, mindfulness should stick onto the object so that mindfulness does not lose sight of the object. So it is the function of sati, is that the sati mindfulness does not lose sight of the object. And also the noting mind and the mindfulness should be face to face or direct. So it is Visaya Vimukhi Bhava Pachupatthana. It means that sati has the manifestation of confronting with the object, so that the noting mind and the object of meditation will become face to face or direct. In order to bring the noting mind face to face or direct with the object, yogi need to aim the mind towards the object. And in order to keep the noting mind reach the object of meditation, one should put effort so that the noting mind will reach the object of meditation. If the yogi is able to note this way, then the manifestation of sati will be obvious. Arakha Pachupatthana, which means that sati, mindfulness, has the manifestation of guarding or protecting the mind. So when the mindfulness is present, the mind is guarded or protected so that the defilements such as greed or craving cannot enter into the mind. So this mindfulness, sati, protects or guards the mind so that defilements cannot enter. So when the mindfulness is present, the mind is guarded or protected away from the defilement. So if the yogi is able to note this way, however strong the sensual object will be, however or whatever sensual object that the yogi come across, this sensual object will not be seducing this yogi, and this yogi will not be bonded by the defilement, and the yogi will not be bonded by the sensual object. Rather than developing mindfulness in such a way that the characteristic, function and manifestation will be obvious to you, so rather than practicing with diligence in order to develop mindfulness, if the yogi lets his or her mind go freely, then there can be desire, craving, and in this way there will be samadha. Sabaji gives an example. A person who owns cows and bulls, they need to herd the cows and bulls. So they need to herd the cattle. Rather than herding the cattle, if she lets the cattle go free on the pasture without herding it, if the cattle go only on the pasture, then it is good. But if the cattle escape and then go into other people's farm, then it will be trouble. So in the same way, people should be content with the sensual object that he, she possesses or he, she is entitled to. But if the person goes on to have fun with the sensual object that he, she has nothing to do or he, she is not entitled to, then there will be many problems. So 1 hour is up. Saraji will continue to explain next day.